Have you ever stood in a place so haunted that you could feel the walls screaming? Have you ever wondered what darkness lurks beneath the surface of forgotten American towns? What secrets the rivers still carry in their muddy currents? Tonight, I need to share something with you that has kept me awake for weeks. Something that history tried to bury beneath layers of silence and shame. In 1860, at the southernmost tip of Illinois, where the Ohio River surrenders to the Mississippi, there existed a marketplace unlike any other. A place where human beings, children no older than 5 or 6, were displayed on wooden platforms and sold to the highest bidder like precious metals extracted from the earth. Their tears meant nothing. Their screams were silenced with whips and threats. And for years, everyone looked away. Everyone except one man. A man who had seen too much, who had lost too much, and who decided that if justice would not come from the heavens, he would drag it up from the depths of his own broken soul. What he did next changed everything. It sparked a fire that spread across 3 states. It made powerful men tremble in their beds at night, and it created a legend that people still whisper about in the backroads of southern Illinois to this very day. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that truth should never be buried no matter how uncomfortable it makes us feel, then you are exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you are about to hear will stay with you forever. This is not just history. This is a reckoning. Today, if you drive to the southern tip of Illinois, where the land narrows into a fragile peninsula squeezed between 2 of America's mightiest rivers, you will find Cairo. What remains of it, at least. Crumbling Victorian mansions with shattered windows stare back at you like hollow skulls. Storefronts that once bustled with commerce now stand as monuments to abandonment, their faded signs advertising businesses that closed generations ago. The streets are nearly empty. The population that once numbered 15,000 has dwindled to fewer than 2,000 souls, most of them elderly, most of them too poor or too tired to leave. The rivers that once made Cairo wealthy now seem to mock the town, flowing endlessly past its decaying waterfront, carrying memories downstream toward the Gulf of Mexico. But if you stand very still on certain evenings, when the fog rolls in from the confluence and the last light of day bleeds orange across the sky, locals will tell you that you can still hear them. The children. Their voices rising from somewhere beneath the mud and the water and the years of accumulated silence. Crying for mothers they would never see again. Crying for fathers who were sold to different plantations in different states. Crying for siblings torn from their arms on auction blocks while white men in fine suits counted their profits and congratulated each other on particularly lucrative transactions. Cairo was never supposed to exist. The land was too low, too prone to flooding, too unstable for permanent settlement. But geography made it irresistible. Whoever controlled Cairo controlled the rivers, and whoever controlled the rivers controlled the commerce of half a continent. By 1860, the town had become something monstrous, a hybrid creature that existed in the gray space between north and south, between freedom and bondage, between civilization and barbarism. Illinois was technically a free state. The institution of human slavery was prohibited by law north of the Ohio River. But laws are only as strong as the men willing to enforce them, and in Cairo, no one was willing. The town sat at the exact point where the free North touched the enslaved South, and that proximity created opportunities for men without conscience. Slave traders from Kentucky and Tennessee and Missouri discovered that Cairo offered something invaluable, plausible deniability. They could bring their human cargo across the rivers under cover of darkness, conduct their sales in warehouses and back rooms and riverboat cabins, and disappear before anyone could raise objections. The local authorities, many of them with financial interests in the trade, looked the other way. The federal marshals assigned to the region were either corrupt or outnumbered, or both. And so the market flourished. Not officially, never officially. But everyone knew. The black residents of Cairo knew because they lived in constant terror of being kidnapped and sold themselves, their free papers meaning nothing to traders who could forge documents or simply destroy them. The white abolitionists knew because they received desperate letters from families searching for loved ones who had vanished without trace. The riverboat captains knew because they transported the merchandise. The bankers knew because they financed the transactions. The hotel owners knew because they provided rooms where buyers could inspect their purchases in privacy. The church ministers knew because they heard confessions from men who could no longer live with what they had done. Everyone knew. And for years everyone remained silent. The children continued to be sold. The families continued to be destroyed. The profits continued to flow into the pockets of men who attended Sunday services and donated to charitable causes and considered themselves respectable members of society. This is the story of how that silence was finally broken. This is the story of one man who refused to accept that evil could triumph simply because good people chose to do nothing. This is the story of Elijah Kincaid and what he did in Cairo in the autumn of 1860 that sent shockwaves through the entire Mississippi Valley and made the name of that town synonymous with a new kind of resistance. But before we can understand what Elijah did, we must first understand what he witnessed. We must descend into the darkness that he lived with every single day. We must see the market as he saw it, feel the horror as he felt it, understand why a man who had never committed an act of violence in his life decided that violence was the only language his enemies would ever understand. If you want to follow more cases like this, stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about American history, stories that reveal the hidden chapters that the textbooks left out, then subscribe to this channel right now, because we are only getting started. Cairo in 1860 was a town of contradictions, a place where the rhetoric of freedom collided daily with the reality of bondage. The main commercial district stretched along the levee for nearly half a mile, a chaotic jumble of warehouses, taverns, boarding houses, and mercantile establishments. Steamboats arrived and departed at all hours, their smokestacks belching black clouds into the Illinois sky, their whistles announcing the constant movement of goods and people up and down the Twin Rivers. Cotton bales stacked 20 feet high lined the wharves, waiting to be shipped north to the textile mills of New England. Tobacco and hemp and corn flowed through the town in endless procession, and mixed in with all that legitimate commerce hidden in plain sight was the other trade, the one that generated the largest profits but appeared in no official ledgers: the human trade. The mechanics of this commerce had been refined over decades into a brutally efficient system. Traders operating out of the Deep South would travel through the border states of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri, purchasing enslaved people from plantations that were downsizing or from estates being liquidated after the death of owners. They would gather their purchases into groups called coffles, chaining them together at the ankles and wrists to prevent escape, and march them overland to the nearest river crossing. Once they reached the rivers, the coffles would be loaded onto specially designed boats with hidden compartments below deck, spaces barely large enough for human beings to sit upright, with no ventilation and no sanitation. The journey to Cairo typically took 2 to 3 days depending on river conditions. During that time, the captives received minimal food and water. Many arrived at their destination sick, dehydrated, traumatized beyond the capacity for speech. But they were still valuable. A healthy adult male field hand could fetch $1,200 at auction, the equivalent of more than $40,000 in modern currency. A skilled craftsman, a blacksmith or carpenter or cooper, might bring twice that amount. Women of childbearing age were priced according to their potential to produce future laborers. And children, especially light-skinned children who could be trained for domestic service or, in the most horrific cases, sold to satisfy the depraved appetites of wealthy predators, were considered the most precious cargo of all. In Cairo, the actual sales took place in several locations, depending on the size of the transaction and the preferences of the parties involved. The largest auctions occurred in a converted cotton warehouse near the southern end of the levee, a cavernous structure with a raised wooden platform at one end where the merchandise could be displayed. Buyers would arrive from plantations across the South, having traveled for days to attend these events, their pockets heavy with gold and their consciences apparently weightless. The atmosphere inside the warehouse on auction days resembled nothing so much as a livestock show. Potential buyers would inspect the human beings on offer with clinical detachment, forcing them to open their mouths so their teeth could be examined, prodding their muscles to assess their strength, asking questions about their skills and temperaments and medical histories. The enslaved people were required to stand in silence during these inspections, forbidden to speak unless directly addressed. forbidden to show any emotion that might lower their perceived value. Children were no exception to these procedures. Buyers would separate them from their mothers to see how they reacted, to test their docility, to determine whether they had been sufficiently broken to accept their fate without resistance. A child who cried too loudly or clung too desperately to a parent was considered defective, likely to cause problems, not worth the investment. And so mothers learned to train their children to remain silent during inspections, to suppress their terror, to make themselves desirable as commodities, even as their hearts shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The smaller transactions, the private sales, took place in the back rooms of certain establishments that everyone in Cairo knew, but no one discussed publicly. The Riverside Hotel, a 3-story brick building overlooking the Ohio River, maintained a suite of rooms on its top floor specifically for this purpose. Traders would bring individual captives there for inspection by buyers who preferred discretion, who did not want their purchases to become public knowledge, whose intentions for their acquisitions were too shameful to conduct in open daylight. What happened in those rooms was whispered about in the black community of Cairo, passed from person to person as warnings about which white men to avoid, which establishments to never enter alone, which areas of town became dangerous after dark. The sounds that emerged from those upper floors on certain nights haunted the dreams of everyone who lived within earshot. Screams that were quickly muffled, weeping that seemed to go on for hours, and then, worse than any sound, the silences that followed. The entire economy of Cairo was structured around this hidden industry. The bankers who financed the purchases, the lawyers who drew up the bills of sale, the doctors who certified the health of the merchandise, the blacksmiths who forged the chains, the seamstresses who made the simple garments the captives wore on the auction block, the cooks who prepared the meals the traders ate between transactions. Everyone profited, directly or indirectly. Everyone was complicit. And presiding over this entire system was a hierarchy of men who had transformed human suffering into a science of profit maximization. At the top sat the major traders, men like Cornelius Whitmore and the Pendleton brothers, who operated networks spanning multiple states, who maintained relationships with plantation owners across the Deep South, who could move hundreds of human beings through Cairo in a single month during peak season. Below them were the local facilitators, men like Sheriff Benjamin Calhoun and Harbor Master Thomas Reeves, whose official positions gave them the power to ensure that the trade continued without interference from state authorities or federal marshals who might occasionally venture into the region. And at the bottom, doing the dirty work that even the traders considered beneath their dignity, were the catchers. These were the men who hunted down escaped captives, who kidnapped free black people and forged documents claiming them as property, who broke the spirits of the newly purchased through systematic brutality. They were feared even by the white residents of Cairo, these catchers. Men like Silas Cutter and Jeremiah Stone, whose reputations for cruelty preceded them wherever they went, whose very names could silence a room. The black community of Cairo existed in a state of permanent terror. Free papers offered no protection when the catchers came. Documentation could be destroyed or challenged or simply ignored. Witnesses could be intimidated into silence or eliminated entirely. Every black resident knew someone who had been taken. A neighbor who stepped out one evening and never returned. A cousin who was grabbed while walking to work. A child who vanished from a yard while playing. The disappearances were so common that they barely qualified as news anymore. They were simply the cost of living in Cairo, the price of existing in this liminal space between freedom and bondage. Into this world, Elijah Kincaid had been born 32 years before. And in this world, he had learned lessons that no human being should ever have to learn. Elijah Kincaid was not supposed to exist. His mother, a woman named Patience who worked as a cook in the household of a Kentucky tobacco planter, had been sold to a Cairo merchant when Elijah was 7 years old, torn from everything she had ever known and transported across the river to this strange town where the rules were different, but the cruelty was the same. The merchant who purchased her, a man named Howard Kincaid, had acquired her specifically for her culinary skills, having heard from associates that she could prepare meals that rivaled the finest restaurants in Louisville or Cincinnati. What Howard Kincaid did not anticipate was that Patience would arrive in Cairo pregnant, carrying a child fathered by a field hand she had loved in Kentucky and would never see again. Illinois law was clear on this matter. Children born to enslaved mothers in free states were legally free. The institution of slavery could not reproduce itself on Illinois soil, but Howard Kincaid, like most white men in Cairo, considered the law an inconvenience to be managed rather than a constraint to be obeyed. He kept Patience and her newborn son in a state of informal bondage, never registering the birth with local authorities, never acknowledging the child's legal status, simply absorbing them both into his household as if they were furniture or livestock. Patience named her son Elijah, after the prophet who had called down fire from heaven to destroy the enemies of righteousness. She taught him, in whispered conversations during stolen moments, that he was free by law even if not by circumstance. She taught him to read and write using a Bible she kept hidden beneath her mattress, risking severe punishment if discovered. She taught him to watch and listen and remember, to note the weaknesses of those who held power over them, to wait for the moment when knowledge could be converted into action. Elijah grew into manhood possessing a combination of qualities that made him uniquely valuable and uniquely dangerous. His mother's teaching had given him literacy at a time when most black people in the region, free or enslaved, could not sign their own names. His childhood in Howard Kincaid's household had taught him the manners and speech patterns of the white middle class, allowing him to navigate their world with a fluency that unnerved them when they noticed it. And his natural intelligence, honed by decades of careful observation, had given him an understanding of how Cairo actually functioned that exceeded the knowledge of most white residents. By 1860, Elijah had established himself as the most sought-after blacksmith in Cairo. His skills at the forge had become legendary. He could repair a broken steamboat fitting in half the time of any white smith. He could shoe horses with such precision that they moved more smoothly afterward than before. He could fabricate custom tools and hardware that plantation owners ordered from hundreds of miles away. His workshop, a sturdy wooden building near the center of the Black District, operated from dawn until well past dark, the sound of his hammer ringing out across the neighborhood like a heartbeat. But blacksmithing was only the visible portion of Elijah's activities. His true power derived from the access his skills provided. Plantation owners who came to Cairo to purchase enslaved people often needed repairs to their wagons or chains or restraints. Traders who moved coffles through the region required maintenance of their equipment. Riverboat captains whose vessels developed mechanical problems during the journey upriver would pay premium prices for emergency repairs. And all of these men, focused on their transactions, spoke freely in Elijah's presence, discussing their business as if he were not there, as if he could not hear, as if he could not understand. They treated him as furniture. They treated him as a useful tool. They never once considered that the useful tool was memorizing every word they said. Over the years, Elijah had compiled a mental catalog of the entire Cairo slave trade. He knew which boats carried human cargo and when they typically arrived. He knew which warehouses were used for storage and which for sales. He knew which white men participated in the trade openly and which preferred to operate through intermediaries. He knew the routes the coffles took through town and the timing of the major auctions. He knew the names of the catchers and their preferred hunting grounds. He knew which lawmen were corrupt and which merely cowardly. And most importantly, he knew the identities of the children who had been sold through Cairo over the past decade, information he had gathered from fragments of overheard conversation, from desperate whispers exchanged with captives who passed through his forge, from the anguished confessions of mothers who came to him seeking any scrap of information about their vanished sons and daughters. The black community of Cairo understood what Elijah represented, even if they could never speak of it openly. He was their eyes and ears in the white world. He was their connection to information that could mean the difference between life and death, between freedom and bondage. When a new catcher arrived in town, Elijah knew within hours and spread the warning through networks so subtle that no white observer ever detected them. When a kidnapping was being planned, Elijah often discovered the details in time to help the intended victim escape. When free black families faced the threat of seizure by traders claiming they were escaped property, Elijah would appear at the crucial moment with documentation and witnesses that made the traders back down. He moved between worlds with a fluidity that should have been impossible. He worked for men whose crimes he documented, He smiled and nodded and performed the rituals of deference that white Cairo expected from black workers, all while harboring knowledge that could have destroyed the reputations and fortunes of the town's most prominent citizens. And he waited. For years, Elijah waited for the right moment, the right circumstances, the right opportunity to convert his knowledge into justice. He told himself that patience was wisdom, that premature action would only result in his death and the loss of everything he had gathered. He told himself that the moment would come, that righteousness would eventually find its opening. But as the years passed and the children continued to be sold, and the screams continued to echo from the upper floors of the Riverside Hotel, and the coffles continued to march through town in chains, Elijah began to wonder if he was fooling himself. He began to wonder if patience was simply another name for cowardice. He began to wonder if he was any different from the white citizens of Cairo who witnessed the same atrocities and told themselves that it was not their responsibility, not their place, not their moment to act. Leave in the comments. Never give up on truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. Tell me your thoughts on what Elijah should have done. How long any person can be expected to witness horror before horror becomes unbearable. The summer of 1860 brought a surge in the Cairo slave trade that exceeded anything the town had previously witnessed. The approaching presidential election had created panic among southern plantation owners who feared that a Republican victory might somehow threaten their property rights. Rumors circulated that Abraham Lincoln, if elected, would immediately abolish slavery throughout the nation, confiscating human property without compensation. These rumors were exaggerated or outright false, but they drove a frenzy of buying and selling as planters rushed to consolidate their holdings, and traders sought to maximize their profits before some imagined day of reckoning arrived. Through Cairo's docks and warehouses and auction rooms, an unprecedented volume of human beings flowed that summer. Elijah watched it all from his forge, his hammer striking metal with increasing fury as each week brought fresh horrors. In June, he witnessed the arrival of a coffle from Missouri containing 37 people, including 9 children under the age of 10. The youngest was a girl of perhaps 4 years, so small that she could not keep pace with the adults and had to be carried by her mother, who was herself barely able to walk after 3 days in the hold of a steamboat. The trader who brought them, a man Elijah had never seen before, complained loudly to his associates that the mother was damaging the merchandise, that her constant holding of the child was creating an unhealthy attachment that would lower both their values at auction. His solution was immediate and brutal. He ordered the child taken from the mother's arms and placed in a separate holding area, ignoring the screams that followed, screams that continued for hours until they finally subsided into a silence that was somehow worse. Elijah learned later that the child had been sold to a buyer from Louisiana who specialized in purchasing young girls for purposes that no one in Cairo would discuss openly, but everyone understood. The mother had been sold separately to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. They would never see each other again. They would never know what happened to each other. The mother would spend the rest of her life wondering if her daughter was alive or dead, if she was suffering, if she remembered the face of the woman who had carried her across 3 states, only to have her torn away in a town whose name she had never heard before. In July, the atrocities intensified. A free black family named the Washingtons, who had lived in Cairo for 15 years and operated a small laundry business, were seized one night by catchers who claimed they were escaped property from Tennessee. The Washingtons had documentation proving their free status, papers signed by a Kentucky judge who had emancipated them years before. The catchers destroyed the papers. They beat Samuel Washington so severely that he died 2 days later from internal injuries. They transported his wife and 3 children across the river before anyone could intervene. When Elijah arrived at the Washington home the next morning, responding to frantic summons from neighbors, he found blood on the walls and the smell of terror still hanging in the air. He found Samuel Washington's body lying on the kitchen floor where the catchers had left it, his face so swollen and discolored that he was barely recognizable as human. He found the remnants of the free papers, torn into fragments and scattered across the yard like confetti, like the documentation of a family's humanity was nothing more than trash to be discarded. The local authorities, when they finally responded, ruled Samuel Washington's death an accident. They claimed he had fallen and struck his head. They made no effort to investigate the disappearance of his wife and children. They filed their paperwork and returned to their offices and resumed their lives as if nothing of consequence had occurred. That same month, Elijah witnessed a scene at the auction warehouse that would haunt him for the rest of his days. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, was being sold separately from his mother, a common enough occurrence that normally attracted little special attention. But this boy, whose name Elijah never learned, refused to accept his fate. When the auctioneer called for him to step forward onto the display platform, the boy ran instead toward his mother, wrapping his arms around her legs, screaming that he would not leave her, that they could not make him go. The auctioneer, a man named Patterson who conducted most of the major sales in Cairo, responded with practiced efficiency. He nodded to one of his assistants, a large man whose primary function was maintaining order during auctions. The assistant walked to where the boy clung to his mother, grabbed him by the hair and lifted him bodily into the air. The mother, unable to restrain herself despite knowing the consequences, struck the assistant across the face. The punishment was immediate. The assistant dropped the boy and turned his attention to the mother, beating her with his fists until she collapsed to the ground, then continuing to kick her as she lay there, unable to protect herself. The boy, witnessing this, launched himself at the assistant, trying to defend his mother, succeeding only in drawing the man's violence onto himself. When it was over, both mother and son lay bleeding on the warehouse floor, their bodies forming a tableau of broken resistance that the assembled buyers observed with varying degrees of interest and indifference. The auctioneer, clearly annoyed by the disruption, declared that the mother had now been damaged and would be sold at a reduced price. The boy, however, would still fetch good money, Patterson assured the crowd. Young boys healed quickly. The bruises would fade. The spirit would be broken more thoroughly than before. In many ways, the assistant had done the eventual buyer a favor. Elijah stood in the shadows at the back of the warehouse, having entered through a side door to deliver repaired chains that a trader had commissioned. He watched the scene unfold with a stillness that concealed the storm raging inside him. He watched the mother being dragged away by men who handled her like damaged goods. He watched the boy being lifted onto the platform where he stood swaying, his small body covered in blood that was already beginning to dry in the August heat, his eyes vacant in a way that suggested something essential inside him had been extinguished forever. He watched the bidding commence, heard the prices called out, saw the boy sold to a planter from Alabama who examined his new purchase with the same clinical detachment one might show when buying a horse. And Elijah felt something shift inside himself that day. Something that had been building for years finally reached a threshold beyond which patience was no longer possible. He understood, standing in that warehouse surrounded by the smell of blood and fear, that no amount of documentation would ever bring justice. No carefully gathered evidence would ever result in prosecutions. No appeal to law or morality or common human decency would ever stop what was happening in Cairo. The system was functioning exactly as designed. It was not broken. It was not corrupt. It was simply evil, and evil did not respond to rational arguments or legal challenges. Evil responded only to power. And power, Elijah realized, could take forms that the men who currently held it had never imagined. Patience Kincaid died on the first Sunday of September 1860, 3 weeks shy of her 63rd birthday. She died in the small room behind Elijah's forge where she had lived for the past decade, ever since Howard Kincaid had finally released her from service, having extracted 35 years of labor from a woman he had never legally owned. She died holding her son's hand, her eyes fixed on his face, her lips moving in words that Elijah had to lean close to hear. She died telling him to remember who he was. She died telling him to remember the prophet whose name he carried, the one who had called down fire from heaven. She died telling him that the time for waiting was over. Elijah buried his mother in the small cemetery on the eastern edge of the Black District, a plot of ground where generations of Cairo's black residents had been laid to rest in graves that bore no markers, in soil that white property owners claimed would eventually be developed into something more profitable. He stood alone at the gravesite long after the few mourners had departed, staring down at the fresh earth, feeling the weight of every promise he had ever made to her, pressing down on his shoulders like the earth itself. His mother had spent her entire life waiting for a justice that never came. She had taught him patience, had counseled him to watch and wait and gather knowledge until the moment was right. But she had also named him after a prophet of fire, and in her final words, She had released him from the burden of patience. She had given him permission to become what he had always known. Deep in his bones, he was destined to become. 3 days after the burial, Elijah received news that shattered whatever remained of his restraint. A woman from the community, a friend of his mother's named Clara, came to his forge with tears streaming down her face. She told him that her granddaughter, a 12-year-old girl named Ruth, who had been born free in Illinois and had never set foot in a slave state, had been taken by the catchers the previous night. Silas Cutter and Jeremiah Stone had grabbed her while she walked home from the church where she had been helping prepare for a wedding. They had forged documents claiming she was escaped property from Kentucky. They had already transported her across the river. By now, Clara sobbed, Ruth was probably already on a boat heading south toward New Orleans, toward the auction houses of the Deep South, toward a fate that no one in the community could bear to speak aloud. Elijah held Clara while she wept. He made her tea and sat with her until her sobs subsided into exhausted silence. And when she finally left, he closed his forge for the first time in 15 years. He barred the door and shuttered the windows and sat in the darkness, surrounded by the tools of his trade, the hammers and tongs and files that had given him access to the white world, that had allowed him to gather the knowledge he now possessed. He sat there through the night, not sleeping, barely breathing, his mind working through calculations he had been making unconsciously for decades. By dawn, he had made his decision. By the following evening, he had begun to act. The men who controlled Cairo's slave trade were not a monolithic force. They were individuals with individual weaknesses, individual secrets, individual vulnerabilities. Elijah knew them all. Cornelius Whitmore, the largest trader operating in the region, maintained a facade of respectability that concealed a gambling addiction so severe he was perpetually in debt to associates who would happily destroy him if they learned the full extent of his financial difficulties. The Pendleton brothers, Marcus and Solomon, hated each other with an intensity that made their business partnership a constant exercise in mutual sabotage. Sheriff Benjamin Calhoun had a taste for young women that he indulged at a house on the edge of town, a taste his wife and congregation knew nothing about. Harbor Master Thomas Reeves was skimming from the bribes he collected, keeping money that was supposed to flow to his superiors in the state government. And the catchers, Silas Cutter and Jeremiah Stone, were wanted for murder in 2 states under different names, a fact that Elijah had pieced together from fragments of conversation over years of patient listening. These were the men who had built the Cairo slave market. These were the men who had torn children from their mothers' arms. These were the men who had killed Samuel Washington and stolen Ruth, and committed 1,000 other atrocities that had never been recorded and would never be punished by any court of law. And these were the men who had no idea that Elijah Kincaid knew their secrets. The catalyst that transformed Elijah's decision into action came on September 15, 1860. A trader named Beaumont arrived in Cairo with the largest coffle anyone could remember. 73 enslaved people, including 22 children, all destined for a special auction that had been arranged to take advantage of the pre-election panic. The auction was scheduled for September 20th. Buyers were already arriving from across the South. The Riverside Hotel was fully booked. The warehouse was being prepared. And Beaumont, in a display of arrogance that would prove fatal, commissioned Elijah to repair a set of specialized restraints designed specifically for children. Small iron cuffs connected by short chains that prevented running, while still allowing the slow shuffling walk required for display on the auction platform. Elijah accepted the commission. He examined the restraints with professional detachment. He noted their construction, their weaknesses, their capacity to inflict suffering on bodies too small to bear such weight. And he recognized in that moment that Providence had delivered into his hands both the target and the timing he needed. The week before the auction brought an event that sealed Elijah's commitment beyond any possibility of retreat. Silas Cutter, emboldened by his successful kidnapping of Ruth and apparently convinced that the black community of Cairo would never dare to resist, made a public example of a man named Thomas Green, a free black carpenter who had made the mistake of looking Cutter in the eye while passing him on the street. Cutter seized Thomas in broad daylight, in the center of the commercial district, surrounded by dozens of white witnesses who did nothing. He accused Thomas of being an escaped slave, of having forged his free papers, of being a threat to public order. And then, while the crowd watched, he administered a beating that lasted nearly 20 minutes, using a whip he carried specifically for such purposes. Elijah was among the witnesses, having been delivering a repaired fitting to a nearby merchant when the commotion began. He stood frozen as Thomas collapsed under the blows, as blood pooled on the cobblestones, as Cutter laughed and invited onlookers to take turns if they wished. He stood there because any intervention would have resulted in his own death and the loss of everything he was planning. He stood there and he watched, and he felt something inside himself turn to iron. Thomas Green survived, though he would never walk properly again. That night, Elijah visited him, brought medicine and food, sat by his bedside and listened to his ragged breathing. And in the darkness of that room, surrounded by the smell of blood and suffering, Elijah whispered to Thomas what he was planning. He asked Thomas if he wanted to be part of it. Thomas, through swollen lips, through teeth that Cutter's whip had shattered, smiled for the first time since the beating. He said yes. The plan that Elijah assembled over the following days was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. He recruited 7 men, each chosen for specific skills and specific grievances. Thomas Green, despite his injuries, would serve as lookout, positioned where he could observe the approaches to the warehouse and signal any unexpected arrivals. Samuel Porter, a former riverboat worker who knew the waterfront better than anyone, would handle logistics. James Mitchell, Marcus Freeman, David Turner, William Hayes, and Robert Jackson would form the strike team, each assigned a specific role based on their abilities and their willingness to risk everything. The target was not merely the auction scheduled for September 20th. The target was the entire infrastructure of the Cairo slave trade. Elijah had mapped every warehouse, every holding facility, every route the coffles traveled through town. He had identified the documents that recorded transactions, the ledgers that tracked profits, the correspondence that connected Cairo to the larger network of traders throughout the South. He had located the caches of money that the traders kept hidden, the weapons they had stockpiled, the boats they used to transport their human cargo. The plan called for simultaneous action at multiple locations, coordinated by signals that Elijah had devised using the sounds of his own forge. The strike would come at midnight on September 19th, the night before the scheduled auction, when the traders would be celebrating their anticipated profits at a dinner organized by Cornelius Whitmore. The 73 enslaved people in Beaumont's coffle would be freed, the warehouses would be burned, the documents would be destroyed, the money would be redistributed to those who had suffered, and the traders themselves, if they resisted, would face the same violence they had inflicted on countless others. Elijah named the operation Prophet's Fire, after the story his mother had told him so many times, the story of Elijah calling down flames from heaven to consume the enemies of righteousness. The date was chosen deliberately. September 19th was the anniversary of his mother's arrival in Cairo 32 years before, the day her bondage had begun, and the day her son would finally end what that bondage had created. The night of September 18th was the last night of the old world. Elijah spent it in his forge, not working, simply sitting among the tools that had defined his life for so long. He thought about his mother, about the children he had watched being sold, about Ruth, who was somewhere in the South by now, about all the accumulated suffering that had brought him to this moment. Across town, at Cornelius Whitmore's mansion, the traders gathered for a preliminary celebration. Champagne flowed. Toasts were raised to anticipated profits. Beaumont boasted about the quality of his merchandise, particularly the children, whom he described as the finest specimens he had ever transported. The men laughed and congratulated each other and made plans for how they would spend their earnings. In the warehouse where the coffle was being held, 73 human beings huddled in darkness, not knowing that their liberation was hours away. Mothers held children close. Men whispered prayers. A young boy, no more than 6 years old, asked his grandmother when they would see the sun again. She told him soon. She had no way of knowing how right she was. At midnight, Elijah rose from his seat and walked to the window of his forge. He looked out at the town that had shaped him, the town that had taken so much from him, the town he was about to transform forever. Then he lit a candle and placed it in the window. Across the Black District, 7 men saw the signal and began to move. The strike began at 12:15 a.m. on September 19, 1860. Samuel Porter disabled the guards at the main warehouse, using a technique he had learned during his years on the river, approaching silently from the water and neutralizing them before they could raise an alarm. Within minutes, the doors were open and James Mitchell was inside, moving among the captives, cutting their restraints, explaining in urgent whispers that they were being freed, that they needed to remain silent and follow instructions exactly. Simultaneously, Marcus Freeman and David Turner entered the Riverside Hotel through a service entrance that Elijah had identified months before. They moved through the darkened hallways to the upper floors where documents were stored, gathering ledgers and correspondence into bags they had brought for the purpose. When a night clerk stumbled upon them, William Hayes, positioned as backup, ensured the man's silence without taking his life. The trader's celebration at Whitmore's mansion was interrupted at 12:30 a.m. when flames became visible on the waterfront. By the time they understood what was happening, 3 warehouses were burning. By the time they reached the docks, the coffle was gone, vanished into the network of safe houses and escape routes that the black community had maintained for decades. Routes that led north toward Chicago and eventually toward Canada and freedom. What followed was chaos. The traders, drunk and disoriented, stumbled through streets illuminated by the fires Elijah's team had set. They shouted orders that no one obeyed. They threatened consequences that no one feared. And when Silas Cutter, the catcher who had beaten Thomas Green and kidnapped Ruth and committed countless other atrocities, attempted to pursue the fleeing captives, he found Elijah waiting for him in an alley near the waterfront. Their confrontation lasted less than 2 minutes. Elijah had spent 32 years preparing for this moment. Cutter had spent those same years believing that black men would never fight back. The disparity in preparation proved decisive. When it was over, Cutter lay motionless on the cobblestones, and Elijah walked away without looking back. By 2 Saturem, the evacuation was complete. 73 people who had expected to be sold the following morning were instead making their way north along routes that Elijah's network had established. The children were carried by adults who had recovered enough strength to move quickly. The elderly were supported by the young. Families who had been separated for the auction walked together again, holding hands, not quite believing that this was real. Elijah did not join the evacuation. He had always known that his role would end with the strike itself. He was too well known, too easily identified, too valuable as a symbol for the authorities to ignore. His escape would have endangered everyone traveling with him. Instead, he remained in Cairo, watching the fires he had set consume the infrastructure of the trade that had defined his life. At dawn, he stood on the levee and watched the sun rise over the confluence of the rivers. The warehouses were still smoldering. The town was in chaos. And somewhere to the north, 73 people were taking their first steps toward lives they had never dared to imagine. The news of what happened in Cairo spread faster than anyone anticipated. Within days, reports reached newspapers in Chicago and St. Louis and Cincinnati. Within weeks, the story had traveled throughout the Mississippi Valley. The name, Prophet's Fire, became a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance that inspired similar actions across the border states. In October, a group of enslaved people in Kentucky destroyed a trading post, using methods that clearly borrowed from Elijah's plan. In November, a warehouse in Missouri was burned to the ground the night before a scheduled auction. In December, 3 catchers in Tennessee were found dead, their bodies left with notes referencing the Prophet of Cairo. The authorities responded with panic and rage. Military units were deployed to border towns. Rewards were posted for information leading to the arrest of those involved in the Cairo strike. New laws were proposed to restrict the movement of black people, free or enslaved, throughout the region. But the fear had already taken root. The traders who had operated with impunity for decades now looked over their shoulders constantly. The auctions that had been conducted openly were moved to secret locations. The system that had seemed unshakable was revealed to be fragile, dependent on the compliance of those it victimized. Elijah Kincaid was captured on October 3, 1860, betrayed by a white merchant who had observed his movements on the night of the strike and waited until the reward money reached a sum worth the risk of coming forward. He was taken by a combined force of state militia and federal marshals, men who had been hunting him for 2 weeks through the swamps and forests of southern Illinois. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted 3 days. Elijah offered no defense beyond a statement he delivered on the final day, speaking for nearly an hour about what he had witnessed in Cairo, about the children sold like gold, about the families destroyed, about the systematic horror that the law had not only permitted but actively protected. He named names, he cited dates, he described atrocities in detail that made several jury members visibly uncomfortable, and he concluded by saying that he regretted nothing, that he would do it all again, that the only crime he had committed was waiting too long to commit it. The verdict was never in doubt. Elijah was sentenced to death by hanging, the execution scheduled for October 31st, 1860. On the morning of that day, as he was led to the gallows that had been constructed in the center of Cairo, hundreds of black residents lined the streets in silent witness. They did not cry out. They did not protest. They simply stood and watched and remembered. And when the trapdoor opened and Elijah fell, a sound rose from the crowd that witnesses would describe for years afterward. Not a scream, not a wail, but a humming, low and resonant, that seemed to come from the earth itself. A sound that carried across the rivers and into the history that Elijah had helped to write. His last words, spoken moments before the hood was placed over his head, became legend. I have seen the fire. It cannot be extinguished now. They buried Elijah Kincaid in an unmarked grave, hoping to prevent his resting place from becoming a shrine. They failed. Within months, the black community had identified the location, and people began making pilgrimages to the site, leaving flowers and stones and small objects of remembrance. Within years, songs had been composed about the prophet of Cairo, spirituals that were sung in churches and fields throughout the South, carrying his story to people who had never heard of Cairo and would never visit Illinois. The 68 survivors of his liberation, those who successfully reached freedom in Canada, established a community there that they named Kincaid Township in his honor. Several of the children he freed grew to adulthood and became leaders in the abolition movement, carrying his memory into the war that would finally end the institution he had fought against. Ruth, the girl whose kidnapping had been the final catalyst for Elijah's action, was eventually located and reunited with her grandmother Clara. She lived until 1923, and until her final days, she told the story of the man who had saved her, the blacksmith who had become a prophet, the slave's son who had refused to let the children be sold like gold any longer. Cairo itself never recovered from the fires of September 1860. The slave trade that had been its economic foundation collapsed in the wake of Elijah's strike, and the legitimate commerce that remained was insufficient to sustain the town's ambitions. The Civil War came the following year, and Cairo became a Union military base, its strategic location finally serving a cause that Elijah would have endorsed. But the town never regained its former prominence. It declined slowly through the decades, hollowed out by economic changes and racial violence in the simple passage of time. Today, if you walk through the ruins of Cairo, you might notice an old forge near what was once the center of the Black District. The building has long since collapsed, its walls crumbled, its roof gone, its tools rusted into unrecognizable shapes. But locals will tell you that on certain nights, when the fog rolls in from the rivers and the moon is hidden behind clouds, you can still hear the sound of a hammer ringing against metal. They will tell you that the prophet never truly left, that his spirit remains to witness whatever justice still needs to be done, that the fire he started burns somewhere beneath the surface of American history, waiting to rise again whenever the children are threatened, whenever the powerful believe they can act without consequence, whenever anyone forgets what one man with nothing left to lose can accomplish. If you watched until here, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know you and understand who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Elijah Kincaid's story touched your heart. Share it so that the memory of what happened in Cairo is never forgotten. And subscribe to this channel, because there are many more stories waiting to be told, many more prophets whose fires have been buried by time, many more truths that deserve to be brought into the light. The market where children were sold like gold no longer exists, but the rivers still flow past Cairo. The land still remembers. And somewhere, in the spaces between what we know and what we have forgotten, Elijah Kincaid is still watching, still waiting, still ready to call down fire from heaven.